I never imagined my world would collapse because of the people I trusted most. My brother, my wife, my family. In one devastating moment, I found out that everything I believed in was built on a lie, and the person I loved the most had betrayed me in ways that no one could ever forgive. I had always believed in the idea of family, loyalty, trust, love. My brother David and I shared that bond, or so I thought. My wife Karen was the woman I promised to spend my life with. But when everything crumbled, it became clear that the world I thought I knew was a lie. Before the betrayal, life was far from perfect, but I had convinced myself it was good enough. Growing up wasn't easy. Our home was a toxic battleground, and my father's oppressive silence was matched only by David's ruthless pursuit of the golden child status. He was the favored one, the one who could do no wrong. And me? I was always just the afterthought, the one who could never quite live up to his shadow. I dreamed of a different life. The day I left for university was the first time I truly felt free. I was starting fresh, creating a future where my past would not haunt me. University brought new experiences, new friends, and for the first time, the chance to build something that was mine. No expectations, no judgments. And that was when I met Karen. She was everything I had never known I needed. Beautiful, intelligent, and full of life. Her smile lit up every room, and I was drawn to her in a way I couldn't explain. Our love grew quickly, and by the time I was in my second year, we were inseparable. But there was one thing I hadn't anticipated: Karen's unexpected pregnancy. We had talked about marriage, about building a future together, but now the decision was made for us. We would get married not just because of the baby, but because we had made a promise to each other. I was determined to make it work, convinced that with the right effort, we could create a beautiful, monogamous family. It should have been the start of a new chapter, but it was the beginning of the worst betrayal I could ever imagine. At first, I didn't see the cracks in our marriage. Everything appeared fine on the surface. Karen and I were living what I thought was a normal life. The baby was born, and as time passed, I became more involved in fatherhood than I had ever imagined I would be. I loved that child with all my heart, and I felt so proud of our little family. But life has a way of throwing curveballs, and the first hint of trouble came slowly. A random comment from a friend, a strange look in Karen's eyes when I mentioned her coworker. Small things I brushed aside. I wanted to believe that we were fine, that the foundation of our marriage built on love and a shared future couldn't be shaken by something as simple as a passing attraction. Then one day the truth came crashing down. I found the first signs. Karen's phone buzzing incessantly late one night. I picked it up without thinking, and what I saw made my stomach churn. A string of flirtatious messages, one after the other, with a name I didn't recognize. A coworker. I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I scrolled through the messages, piecing together the details of their late-night chats. The conversations were casual at first, just friendly banter, but then they grew more intimate, more suggestive. My mind screamed in disbelief, but I didn't want to accept it. It was the last thing I ever thought could happen. I confronted Karen the next day, my voice low and trembling. Her face turned pale as I asked her to explain. She denied everything at first, claiming it was just harmless flirting, nothing more. But deep down, I knew better. I had trusted her with my heart, with my future. Despite everything, I made the decision to forgive her. We had been through so much together, and I didn't want to destroy our family over a momentary lapse in judgment. I convinced myself that this was a one-time mistake, a brief fling, a misstep. The vows we had made still mattered, and I wanted to believe we could get past it. I should have trusted my instincts. A few months later, the doubt crept back into my mind. The second affair wasn't as easy to ignore. Karen had gone to visit her family for a weekend, and when she came back, I noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor. Something distant, almost cold. And then I found out she had rekindled an old relationship, an ex-boyfriend from her college days. They'd shared a few drinks, one thing led to another, and Karen slept with him. My heart sank as I listened to her confession. The hurt, the betrayal, it was almost unbearable. This time, I wasn't sure I could forgive her. It was a second affair, a deeper violation of the trust we had worked so hard to rebuild. But again, I tried to convince myself that we could make it through. I didn't want to be a failure. I wanted to believe that love, even after such wounds, could heal. But inside, the foundation of our relationship was crumbling. I didn't know it then, but these were the warning signs, the early tremors of the earthquake that was about to hit. My world was about to shatter in a way I couldn't have possibly imagined. I never imagined the final blow would come from her. I had spent months trying to rebuild what had been broken, convincing myself that our marriage was salvageable. But nothing could have prepared me for what Karen told me that night. We were sitting on the couch just like any other night. The TV was on, but neither of us was really watching it. The silence between us had become deafening. I had felt for a while that something was off, but I didn't know how to address it. It wasn't until she spoke that everything in my world shattered. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hit me before they even fully registered in my mind. I looked at her, the pit in my stomach deepening. "I've been lying to you," she continued, her eyes not meeting mine. "It's not just about the coworker or the ex. I've been having an affair with David." I froze. My brother, the man I had trusted more than anyone else in the world. My own flesh and blood. The one person who knew me better than anyone. The man who was supposed to have my back. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. But there she was, telling me that she had been sleeping with David, my brother, the same man I had shared so much with. The realization clawed at my chest, choking me. "You're lying," I whispered, but it wasn't even a question. "No," Karen said, her voice cold and emotionless. "I wish I was, but I'm not. It's been going on for months. I didn't mean for it to happen, but we couldn't stop. We have a connection that you wouldn't understand." I felt the room spin as her words cut through me. I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream, to hit something, anything, but all I could do was sit there, utterly numb. How had I missed this? How had I not seen the signs? And then the final gut punch. She told me that the child I had been raising, our daughter, wasn't even mine. David was the father. The world stopped. It was as if time itself had frozen, leaving me trapped in an endless loop of disbelief and rage. My brother, the man I had once looked up to, the man I had trusted, had not only betrayed me in the worst possible way, but had taken something I had never imagined losing. My family. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor as I did. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. "Why?" I croaked, my voice barely recognizable. "Why David? Why not anyone else?" Karen's expression remained unchanged. It was as if she had already detached herself from the weight of the words she had just spoken. "We had something real, something you couldn't give me," she said. That was it. I had been the fool. I had spent years believing in a love that wasn't real, in a family that had been built on lies. "You're sick," I spat, my voice raw with anger. But even as I said it, part of me still couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe what she had done to me, to our family. "David's the father of your child," she repeated, almost nonchalantly, as if the news didn't even faze her. "The connection we have, it's undeniable." Her words felt like poison seeping into my veins, burning me from the inside out. The child I had cared for, the one I had raised and loved like my own, wasn't mine. How could she do this to me? How could he? I didn't yell. I didn't storm out of the room. I didn't even cry. I simply packed my things, slowly, carefully. "I'm done," I said, my voice trembling but steady. "I can't be here anymore. I can't be with you." I didn't give her a chance to respond. There was nothing left to say. The marriage was over. The family I had fought so hard to protect had been destroyed, not by some external force, but by the very people I had trusted the most. As I gathered my things, Karen tried to justify her actions. She claimed that she had been unhappy for a long time, that our marriage had lost its spark, but I couldn't listen to it anymore. It was all just excuses. David and Karen's affair had been going on for far too long. I had been blind to it, and I had allowed it to continue. But not anymore. "I don't want your apologies," I said, my voice hardening. "I don't want anything from you." I was calm, too calm, and I realized it. The rage that had consumed me earlier had somehow settled into a quiet determination. I was done. It wasn't just the affair that hurt me. It was the years of lies, the years of deception. I walked out of the house without looking back. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was also the most freeing. The weight that had been on my shoulders for so long was finally lifting, and in its place, a clarity began to emerge. The day after Karen's confession, I couldn't sit still. My mind was a whirlwind of anger, disbelief, and frustration. I had spent the night at a friend's place, trying to process everything, but no amount of space could prepare me for the confrontation that was about to come. David, my brother, the person I had once trusted above all else. I had no idea what to expect, but I knew I had to face him. I couldn't just sit back and pretend nothing had happened. I called him, my hands shaking slightly as I dialed his number. His voice on the other end was casual, almost like nothing was wrong. "Hey man, what's up? Get to my place, now," I said, my voice sharp. There was a brief pause before he responded, sounding a little more concerned. "What's going on? You okay?" "I'm fine, just come over." I hung up without waiting for a response. When he arrived, I could see it in his eyes. There was something different about him, a nervousness he never showed before. He stood in the doorway, hesitating. "What's this about, bro?" I didn't waste any time. I stared at him, the anger building in my chest like a storm ready to break. "You and Karen," I said, my voice low and cold. "You've been sleeping with my wife. How long?" David's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment I saw guilt flash across his face, but it was gone in an instant. His confidence returned, and he crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "It's not what you think, man," he began, but I cut him off. "Don't lie to me. I know everything." I told him about Karen's confession, how she admitted to the affair, and the bombshell about the child not being mine. David's expression didn't change. Instead, he let out a bitter laugh. "So what? You think I'm supposed to feel bad about it? You were too busy with your perfect little life to see what was going on. We couldn't keep living the lie." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So you thought betraying me was the answer?" He shrugged, his arrogance dripping in every word. "Look, it just happened. You're always so perfect, always so focused on your ideal family, that you never noticed how unhappy Karen was. She came to me, and things just worked." "Worked?" I asked, the disgust in my voice clear. "You're my brother, David. How could you do this to me? How could you do this to our family?" David's smirk faltered. "I didn't know you anything, man. You were always the golden child, always the one everyone looked up to. You think I never noticed? I've been waiting for something like this to happen." The words stung, but I didn't let it show. "You're pathetic," I spat. "You've ruined everything." He leaned back, crossing his arms more tightly. "You can't change anything now. I'm done with your little family drama. Karen and I are together now, and that's the way it's going to stay." His arrogance was suffocating, but there was one thing he didn't know. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. "I'm exposing everything, David," I said, my voice steady. "I'm telling Mom and Dad what you've done, and you can't stop me." His expression shifted, just for a moment. There was a flicker of fear, but then, like always, he masked it with arrogance. "Go ahead. You think they'll believe you over me? You're just pissed because I took what you couldn't keep. You'll look like the fool." But I was done. There was no turning back now. I was going to make sure everyone knew the truth. Family's reaction. I called a family meeting for that evening. David had already left my place, but I knew the confrontation with our parents would be even more explosive. When Mom and Dad arrived, I could tell something was off. Mom's eyes were wide, her expression unreadable. Dad was quiet, his jaw tight as if he could sense something was wrong. "David's having an affair with Karen," I said, my voice shaking but resolute. Mom looked at me like I had slapped her. "What are you talking about? That's ridiculous." "No, it's not, Mom," I said, frustration boiling over. "Karen confessed to me last night. She's been sleeping with David for months, and the child I thought was mine, it's his." For a long moment there was silence. Then Mom's face softened. "You're lying. This can't be true." But Dad, ever the stoic figure, spoke. "If this is true," his voice trailed off, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes. Disappointment. The father I had always looked up to seemed to shrink before me. "It's true, Dad," I said. "I'm done pretending." Dad's face hardened as he turned toward David's name. "David's always been our golden boy, but this is too much. He's crossed a line that can't be uncrossed." Mom tried to defend him. "You don't understand. He didn't mean it. He loves her." "It was a mistake," Dad shook his head. "No more. I won't tolerate this. David has no place in this family anymore." And just like that, everything I had feared came true. My brother was out of the family. Father's punishment of David. Dad called David later that evening, a harsh conversation that I could only overhear. "You're no longer welcome here," Dad said firmly. "I won't support you anymore. No more college funds. No more help." I could hear the tension in the air as David tried to argue. But it was over. I could hear David yelling, but the voice in my head drowned him out. I'd heard enough. David was going to pay for what he had done, even if it wasn't enough for me to ever forgive him. The next few days felt like a blur. I had done everything I could to keep my family intact, but the reality was undeniable now. The marriage I had fought for, the one I had tried so desperately to save, was over. It had all been a lie. I filed for divorce that same week. I thought it would bring some kind of relief, but instead it was like the final nail in the coffin. The papers felt like they were burning a hole through my hands. Karen's lawyer was ruthless. She tried to manipulate the situation, asking for alimony, even though I was the one who had been betrayed. They wanted to capitalize on my emotional vulnerability. The audacity of it all was staggering. But the paternity test results were what truly broke me. It came back confirmed. David was the biological father of the child I had been raising as my own. My world once again felt like it was crumbling beneath me. I had poured my heart into raising that child, and now everything I thought I knew was called into question. I couldn't help but feel like I had been a fool, but more than that, I felt like I had been robbed of something so deeply important, a bond I thought was sacred. I tried to keep my composure, but every time I looked at my daughter, it was like I was seeing a stranger. The love I had for her didn't change, but the pain of knowing she wasn't mine was unbearable. I had been so sure of my place in her life. Now I didn't know where I stood. The divorce proceedings were tense. Every encounter with Karen felt like a battle. She cried, she pleaded, but I was resolute. There was no going back. The woman I had loved, the woman I had married, was nothing like the person I had believed her to be. When the final papers were signed, I thought I'd feel free, but freedom didn't come. Instead, a deep sense of loss settled in. The marriage I had dreamed of, the family I had imagined, was gone, and I was left to pick up the pieces of a life I no longer recognized. I moved into a small bachelor pad. The space was a reflection of where I was in life, empty, cold, and lonely. It wasn't much, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I didn't have to worry about anyone else's emotions, anyone else's needs. It was supposed to feel like freedom, but instead it felt like a cage of its own. There were nights when I sat in the dimly lit apartment, staring at the walls, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. My thoughts were constantly consumed by the betrayal, the face of my brother, my wife. Those images wouldn't leave my mind. Therapy became a lifeline. I started attending sessions twice a week, trying to make sense of everything. My therapist encouraged me to speak about the things I had buried for so long, the pain of my childhood, the toxic relationship with my father, and the immense weight of the betrayal I had faced. In the quiet of my apartment, the healing process began, slowly, so slowly that sometimes I wasn't sure if I was healing at all. But each day brought a little more clarity. I realized that my pain wasn't just about losing my wife or my brother, it was about losing myself. I had been so consumed by trying to hold everything together that I had forgotten who I was. I started focusing on small victories. I was back in the gym, something I had neglected for months. I began reading again, something that used to bring me peace. My job became a refuge, a place where I could shut out the chaos and focus on something productive. But the hardest part was the quiet, the emptiness. I had grown so used to the noise of family life, to the presence of my wife and child, that now The silence felt like a constant reminder of what I had lost. Even so, I knew this was part of the journey. Healing wasn't linear. It wasn't about getting over the betrayal. It was about accepting it, learning from it, and moving forward. As I sat in my new place, I realized something. Life wasn't about the perfect marriage or the picture-perfect family. It wasn't about holding on to what I thought I deserved. It was about resilience. It was about learning to adapt, even when the foundation beneath you crumbles. And though it felt like the end of everything I had known, I knew it was just the beginning of something new. I was rebuilding my life, brick by brick. And while it was painful and slow, I could see that there was hope on the horizon. I was starting to understand that in the end, it was me who would have to be there for myself. The days after the divorce dragged on in a numb haze. Just when I thought I had begun to find some kind of peace in my new life, David called. I didn't expect it. In fact, I didn't even recognize the number at first. It had been weeks since the confrontation, weeks since I'd last spoken to him, and yet here he was again, showing up at the worst possible moment. "Hey," his voice cracked, more fragile than I'd ever heard it. "We need to talk." I felt an inexplicable anger surge through me. After everything he had done, after the way he had betrayed me, he had the audacity to call. My mind swirled with a cocktail of disbelief and frustration, but I answered anyway. "What could we possibly have to talk about?" I snapped, unable to hide my resentment. "I'm sorry, all right? I know I screwed up, but I need your help," he pleaded. The desperation in his tone was palpable. "Karen and I are struggling. I need you to help me fix this." I almost laughed. The irony of the situation was too much to bear. My brother, the man who had ruined my life, was now asking for my help. He had stolen everything from me, and now he expected me to bail him out. "I think you're confused, David," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "You made your choices. You need to deal with the consequences like the rest of us. I'm not your savior." His silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't going to be the one to pull him out of the mess he had created. There was no going back. There was no fixing this. The call ended without any further words. I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. It was the closure I didn't know I needed. David's desperation, his plea for help, was just another reminder of how far he had fallen from the pedestal I once placed him on. A few days later, I received another call. This time, it was from my mother. Her voice was softer than usual, laced with concern, but also with an unmistakable sense of urgency. "David is struggling," she said. "I know you're angry, but he needs help. He's been lost without you." I could hear the heartbreak in her words, the way she tried to justify everything David had done. She had always been blind to his faults, refusing to acknowledge the truth even when it slapped her in the face. "I'm not going to help him," I responded firmly, the weight of everything we had been through settling in my chest. "He made his bed, and now he has to lie in it." "But you're his brother. You're the only one who can—" "No," I cut her off. "He made his choices. He betrayed me. He betrayed this family. He's not my responsibility anymore." The silence that followed was heavy. I knew my mother had expected me to cave, to forgive him, to be the bigger person. But I couldn't. Not this time. I had spent my entire life trying to please her, trying to be the good son. And where had it gotten me? Betrayed, broken, alone. "I'm sorry, Mom," I added quietly, a deep sadness creeping into my voice. "But I'm done." The words hung in the air between us, and I could almost hear her processing the finality of it. She didn't say anything more, and the call ended shortly after. My father's reaction was a bit different. After hearing everything, he had called me into his study. His expression was unreadable, but I could tell something had shifted in him. "David doesn't deserve the things he's been given," my father said, the sternness in his voice echoing his disappointment. "He's crossed a line, and I can't ignore that." It was the first time I had heard my father speak with such authority about David's actions. For years, I had watched him blindly defend his son, turning a blind eye to his flaws, but now there was no hiding the truth. "I've already made my decision," my father continued, "and David will no longer be part of the family. I'm cutting him off. No more college funds. No more financial support. He's on his own." A sense of vindication washed over me as I listened. The man who had always stood by David, the man who had turned his back on me, was now making a stand. For the first time, I felt like my father had chosen the right side. "You don't have to worry about him anymore," my father added, his voice softer this time. "I'll make sure he faces the consequences of his actions." As he spoke those words, something in me shifted. This was the closure I needed, not from David, not from Karen, but from the family that had failed me. It was a powerful moment. The foundation of my family had fractured, and now the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. David's life spiraled further after the fallout. Without the family support, without the resources he had always relied on, he and Karen were left to fend for themselves. I knew it wouldn't be easy for them. The money dried up, and their once comfortable life was now a distant memory. The truth was, I didn't feel sorry for them. Not anymore. They had made their choices, and now they had to live with them. I had my own journey to continue. My life was far from perfect, but it was mine. And as for David and Karen, they were now a distant memory, no longer part of my future. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized that my family had taught me a hard lesson. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who can hurt you the most. But in the end, it's up to you to decide how much you let that pain shape you. It's strange how time can blur the sharp edges of pain. The days, the weeks, the months that had passed since the betrayal felt like a blur. But now, as I look back, I see it all more clearly than ever before. It was no longer the crushing weight of heartbreak that consumed me. No, what remained was a quiet, lingering reflection. I was no longer the person I had been, the person who had been willing to forgive, to hold on to the illusion of family, of trust. That person had died with the revelation of David and Karen's betrayal. I had learned in the hardest of ways that family didn't always mean loyalty, and loyalty didn't always mean love. The people who should have had my back, who should have been my safe harbor, had torn me apart. And yet, in the ashes of all that destruction, I had built something stronger, myself. I'd spent years investing in a marriage that was never truly mine. I had given everything to a family that wasn't truly mine. The pain of realizing that the child I had raised as my own wasn't mine had been devastating, but I had finally come to terms with it. The past didn't define me. What mattered now was how I chose to move forward. I thought about the lessons I'd learned, about forgiveness, about trust, and about self-worth. There was a time when I would have tried to mend the broken pieces of my family. I would have tried to be the bigger person, the one who could swallow the pain and continue on with a smile. But no longer. The man I had been, broken, forgiving to the point of self-destruction, was gone. Now I was free. In the present, things were quieter, calmer. My new life was nothing like the one I had imagined, but I had come to embrace that. I was still living in my bachelor pad, a small apartment that felt like my own for the first time in years. The walls weren't just walls. They were boundaries I had set to protect myself. The silence that once felt so lonely now felt like peace. Work had become a haven, and I'd been promoted to a position I had worked for, earning the respect I deserved. There was something deeply satisfying about achieving success on my own terms, without the expectations or the manipulations of anyone else. Therapy had been a game changer. It wasn't easy at first. I resisted the idea of talking to someone about my pain, but it helped. It allowed me to unravel all the hurt I had kept inside for so long. Each session was a step closer to understanding who I was and who I wanted to become. I wasn't ready for a relationship. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The idea of trusting someone again, of opening up to someone, was terrifying. But that was okay. I wasn't rushing. I was focused on healing, on finding peace in my own company. It was a strange feeling, being alone but not lonely. I had learned that life, like the journey I had been on, wasn't about finding answers. It was about the process of healing, of self-discovery, and of knowing when to let go. And let go I had. I no longer felt the need to hold on to the past. The pain would always be a part of me, like a scar I carried. But it no longer defined me. And as I stood there looking at my reflection in the mirror one evening, I finally understood. The hardest lessons come from the deepest pain, but they also lead you to a place of freedom you never thought possible. I was free, and for the first time in a long time, I was okay with that. If you've been touched by this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay updated on more heartfelt journeys and powerful life lessons. We'd love to hear where you're listening from. Share your thoughts and location in the comments below.